Welcome to our panel on standardization and open source. Today, we want to discuss with a group of experts why and how an open source project should consider engaging with the idea of standardization. The relation between open source software and standardization is not always an easy one. This starts from different understanding of the terms like open and doesn't end with the differences in the mindsets of the involved people. From an open source perspective, standardization often seems to be slow and compromised and sometimes even politically driven, while open source is seen as fast and agile. In various cases, open source comes with a winner-takes-it-all mentality, which is setting the de facto informal kinds of standards, sometimes under the control of a single commercial organization. From a standardization perspective, open source is often seen as unsustainable and fast-changing without clear governance structures, while standardization has a long-standing track record of adding value to the industry. For example, one of the first standardizations of a technology was done in the midst of the 19th century. At that time, bilateral negotiations on telegraphy started and culminated in the foundation of the ITU in 1865, most likely the first international standards defining organization, or so-called SDO. The history of software and open source software is much shorter, but due to its nature, software was and is revolutionary to the capabilities of technical systems. There are good reasons why an open source project should consider standardizing the underlying specifications or APIs. I'm happy to welcome our expert panel to discuss this today. Let me first introduce our panelist. From the domain of standardization, I welcome David Philipp. David holds various positions in different bodies at the ISO JTC1 and CENELEC. Among others, he holds the position of the convener of the Working Group 3 Trustworthiness at the ISO JTC1 SC42 on artificial intelligence, and he also acts as an ISO JTC1 mentor. In this role, he helps organizations to liaise with the ISO JTC1 organization. Next, I would like to welcome Arlen Nipper. Arlen is the co-inventor of MQTT and president and CTO of TheraSlink. He's for more than 40 years active in the field of IoT and IIoT and actively engaged in the MQTT and Sparkplug activities at the Eclipse Foundation. And he's the current chair of the Sparkplug Working Group. On the standardization side, he accompanied the standardization of MQTT and as an OSS standard and subsequently at ISO IEC standard. Finally, I want to welcome Ian Craigs. Ian worked for more than 35 years at IBM, where he was one of the first contributors of MQTT software to the Eclipse PAHO project. Today, he works as a freelance, is PAHO project lead, a member of the MQTT Technical Committee, co-chair at OSS for the standardization of MQTT SN, and contributes to the standardization of Eclipse Sparkplug. A warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for sharing your experience with the audience. So, my first question is for you, David, and it's a rather generic one. How does standardization work?
Okay, thanks for that question, Michael. I assume we are trying to explain standardization to people who are not experienced that, who are primarily developers. So I would say the key word is consensus. Standardization happens by consensus. And to achieve consensus, you need some process. So that's why standardization is trusted as a method to achieve technical interoperability. So I think that would be hopefully enough for a really brief intro to what standardization is about. Hopefully we will have a chance to go deeper based on some other questions.
Okay, Arlen, from your experience with MQTT, from a code-first open specification starting point to international standard, what are the advantages from your perspective to become a standard?
Well, I guess, Michael, from my perspective, well, first of all, you have to realize when Andy Stanford Clark, Ian, myself started working on MQTT, we were just trying to solve a problem for Phillips 66. The Internet of Things didn't exist, cloud computing didn't exist, and the fact that MQTT has become a dominant technical resource is pretty incredible. But when we started, I think very uniquely, Andy and I were quite adamant in the original specification being open so that people could get their hands on it and implement it. And that was very unique. In the late 1990s, IBM wasn't known to do that very often. But we found out we started losing opportunities because people would ask us, well, is MQTT open? Well, oh yeah, it's open. You can download the spec, but does it have a standard? And I remember one of the big projects was actually the big rail project for railroad safety in the US. MQTT had been chosen, but AMQP actually got picked because it had a standard. Back to David's point, is that it had something that had standardized it, that could let you test it and know that your interoperability between multiple MQTT clients and MQTT brokers. So getting MQTT into the Eclipse Software Foundation and getting it documented properly was huge, I believe, in the adoption overall globally for MQTT.
Okay, great, thanks. Ian, you are the project lead of the Pahoo project, and I think yes, all the on Sparkplug and active on the Sparkplug part. What are typical steps for an open source project to prepare a standardization process?
So I think the first thing is to decide on the standards organization that you are going to take part in to produce that standard. And there are various factors that are involved in that decision. One of them might be familiarity. I mean, one of the reasons that IBM chose OSS as the place to formulate the MQTT standards was because IBM had a long history of dealing with OSS, and they knew what the procedures were and how to get that to completion. But there are various requirements from different standards bodies, so that they can vary from one to the other. For instance, the Eclipse Foundation standards are based on the Java standardization process. And one of the requirements for that to become a standard is that there should be a TCK, because I think anybody who's familiar with Java is familiar with the JCK for J2EE. At OSS, a TCK or a test suite is not a requirement. And obviously there's the RFC process. There's a variety of standards bodies, so that they each have different requirements. The outcome at the end might be similar in that you get a standard that is owned by that body and not by one company in particular, but the process of getting there can be quite a bit different. And in my mind, I'm always thinking about the comparison with the C++ standards, which have been going on for a long time. They started out in the 1990s when people wanted to standardize C++, and it's been going on for more than 20 years now, and it's had a life of its own. And in some cases, you think, well, maybe that the standardization process has gone on for too long. Maybe it's happening, becomes an end in itself. And that's something that I think both in MQTT and Sparkplug that we are keen to avoid. We only want to do that, take those steps which are really useful to people. Another important factor is that all the contributors to that, the material that you're going to be using in that standard, are willing to give the IP that they have, the necessary IP, away to that standards body. And some people forget about that, and think, oh, maybe we can write a few patents based on the experiences we have. But if they are necessary to implement that standard or use it, then that standard is going to become useless if those patent rights aren't granted to the organization. So that can be a key aspect, especially for large organizations which are very keen to hoard their IP because it's a valuable business asset. But without doing that, then the standard itself isn't useful.
So maybe I could interject here. The IP management is an important part of standardization process. You are not exactly giving the IP to the organization. You are working under an IPR mode, which can differ slightly as per organization. But you are actually, making a promise that the IP is free to use by the implementers of the standard, because it's essential to implement that standard. So there's just a small clarification here, and this is what makes a standard open, rather than proprietary. if this is granted for future implementers. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So the next step, I think, is to gather the interested parties, because you probably don't want a standard produced, or it's more useful to have a standard that's produced by multiple organizations rather than just one, because if it's just one, even though the work is done through a standards body or under a standards body, it can still seem to be owned by one particular company or corporation. So gathering interested parties to participate is the key thing. In addition to that, it can be quite a tortuous process, or you have to keep going. It isn't perhaps the most interesting thing to do to produce that standard. So you have to have some motivation to get to that end point. So having multiple participants helps you get through those stages to that end point as well. In large organizations, it might be, the standardization might be important. Everybody says it's important, but it's not as important to maybe getting the next release of the software out. So you need to be able to get enough people motivated at different points to be able to push that standardization through to the completion. And I think everybody can sympathize with that sort of point of view. And of course, then one of the final points is you have, for the materials that you have available, the specification or the API specification, documentation, whatever it is, you then need to be able to submit that as a starting point to the standardization process. I think those are the key points that I can think of.
David, in your role as a JTC1 mentor, what would be your advice to a project, perhaps the Eclipse Foundation, which considers starting the journey of standardization? What is the process there concrete? So and perhaps also some more detailed information. How long would it take to become a standard? What are the documents needed to get into this kind of discussion with, and how to get started?
So yeah, one of my roles, as you said, is a JTC1 PAS mentor. This is a role within ISO IEC Joint Technical Committee 1, which is the global IT standardization authority. Actually the only joint technical committee between ISO and IEC. And this is, if you want, like one of the very advanced stages in standardization, becoming an international standard. But what Arlen and Ian have more experience with that, what you call a consortia-based standardization, or like voluntary industry standardization. So Eclipse Foundation gives you the ability to develop both the code and the specification. And so of course, you cannot just make code a standard. You need to have a specification. So that's the very first minimalistic requirement, And everyone will know, like a developer, when you start a Genius open source project, once you get a number of contributors and when you start shooting for interoperability, it will not be enough to have just code. You will have to progress to spec at some point. And for some time, it will be okay to develop the spec informally as a wiki. Then it will, the complexity will grow. So you will realize you will need some process for it. So then you probably join an organization, a consortium such as OSS or Eclipse Foundation. So you can spin off a formal, formal specification process with IPR management and process. And so those are, having a good due process. This is what I mentioned before, standards are coming about by consensus. So you need to have a consensus-driven process, a good IPR management framework. If you have these things, it doesn't matter where your standard resides. If you have these things in your organization, then you are able, those are the main prerequisites to progress to an international standard. I mean, like, depending on a code project maturity, your standardization needs evolve. At the beginning, you may be fine with just the code writing style guide, then you might be okay with a wiki. Later on, you might be okay with a spec that is formally approved every now and then. At some point, you absolutely need to introduce IPR management framework for essential patents. And when you have all this, then at some point you might want to spread the influence of your standard by international adoption. That means being adopted as a standard by one of the jure standardization bodies, such as ISO, IEC, or ITU that you mentioned. ITU is actually a UN agency, but actually the jure standardization bodies are set up based on World Trade Organization principles of lowering business barriers. So, like moving up to the international standardization will give you kind of new audiences where you will become visible for government procurements, things like that. Yeah, to just summarize, you need a good spec process, IPR management framework. If your IPR management framework is RAND or RF or non-assertion covenants, things like that, then it's suitable for being moved to the elevation to international level. And this happens in 2 stages. Like first, the organization gets approved. It explains to JTC1 what are their processes, what is their IP framework, and tell them in what scope they would like to contribute. You need to be in IT, obviously, to be able to contribute to JTC1. You cannot be, railroads or medicines. You have to be IT, right, for JTC1. And then after the JTC1 approves your organization as a good citizen, like a pass submitter, and with the scope that you indicated, and then you have the ability to use the pass transposition process, basically submit your specifications for approval by the national bodies, which is the principle of international standardization. It is not being approved by experts or companies. It's approved by national bodies because the international standardization organizations, the jure standardization organizations, are actually working as federations of national standardization bodies. And these are actually the members of those organizations. So that might be maybe too deep down the rabbit hole.
No, it's interesting to get started. And my next question, now let's target the projects where we would like to give perhaps some guidance and advice. And I would like to ask all of you, why and when a project should think about if it makes sense for them to have a specification and enter some sort of standardization process. So I'm sure not each and every project. Not for each and every project it would be reasonable to go that way, but for sure if there are projects or working groups like open specifications like Sparkplug, what from your perspective are some sort of criteria to decide for my project, does it make sense to consider standards to become a standard or not? Something like interoperability or something similar. Arlen, maybe you want to start.
Well, I think that's the beauty of working with the Eclipse Software Foundation. MQTT was kind of a hybrid where it kind of branched off. In other words, Ian was working on PAHO at the same time that we were taking it through the OSS standards body. But I think the beautiful thing about that is probably 99.9% of all MQTT projects probably start with PAHO, and that's a great contribution to the community as a whole. I think that's why MQTT has exploded, is that most people can grab a Raspberry Pi and have a rudimentary MQTT infrastructure up and running in a couple of hours. And we're going to try to follow that same notion with the Sparkplug specification. But we seriously had to think about this because this was disruptive for the industry to go to a software standards body instead of an industrial like the ISA or the IEEE. But I think they haven't caught up with the fact that software is eating the world, right? And so we need to be able to rapidly go out, adopt this technology, have the documentation, have the code there to get started. And I think the PAHO project started that. And I think based on the success of PAHO, we started the Tahoe project, and based on that, we started the Sparkplug project.
But what is specific with the PAHO project that it makes? This is a good candidate for going for standardization. So why is that? What are the criteria for a project to get started with standardization, and what criteria where say if you have a very dedicated, let's say, simulation project, you may not want to go for standardization, right? But if you have something where, like in the domain of IoT, becoming a standard would make much more sense. So is there anything you can any experience, lessons learned you give from your perspective? What are criteria on how to judge if it makes sense to think about standardization at all?
Well, if you it's funny how these things get started, right? Again, MQTT, we had no idea where it would end up. Sparkplug, the CirrusLink team, we did Sparkplug A for our own sanity. I mean, literally, because everybody was doing MQ. The good thing about MQTT is you can publish anything you want on any topic. The bad thing about MQTT is you can publish anything you want on any topic. And so Sparkplug, all it did was try to standardize what was inside of the MQTT topic and payload. That was the goal of it. And then industry it blossomed from there. It was customers going, oh, we want to do this, but if we go to an OEM that says they implement Sparkplug, we want to have a verification that if I plug, equipment A and equipment B into broker from vendor C, that it's all going to work together. And that's the kind of the beauty of all that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the key aspects, or probably the key aspect. I mean, you can imagine or think about the Bluetooth standards. It would be no good if all the devices talked a different version of Bluetooth, which in the beginning they basically did, because in the year 2000 you couldn't get one Bluetooth device or whatever it was started to talk to another. It took a decade before all Bluetooth devices could talk to each other, because the standards had to be ironed out to get rid of all those loopholes where people were implementing things in a different way. Mm-hmm. And so that's a key aspect, and something similar applied to MQTT, because we imagined that people would implement MQTT, different vendors would implement MQTT, both on the client side and the broker side. So there need to be a lot of interoperability. And so in those cases, it's a no-brainer that you need some sort of standard to guide you. And then it needs to go to a standards body. Not one organization can own that, because it's just impossible then, because they can change it at will, and then every vendor has to try and keep up. So, that's something that people want to try and avoid.
Right. And a good example there, Michael, is if we look out there, Facebook used MQTT for Facebook Messenger, right? Well, they don't need a standard. They know how it works, and it works within the Facebook organization. That's fine. But again, what was unique with MQTT in, the way that Andy and I had envisaged it, for operational, like for pipeline control systems, was where it was invented. And to that point, it needed that standardization. So MQ, like I said, it took off in so many different directions. And I think you'll probably see some more specifications around topic and payload representations for other applications. So, if you're an engineer and you're out there writing code and you're wanting to start a standard, I think one of the criteria would be, how do you want people to use this? Do you want it to be interoperable? If you want it to just to be, hey, it's a piece of code you download, it does something really cool, then you probably don't need standardization. But if you want a bunch of people to download it and then it all be interoperable, that's where you have to start thinking about, how are we going to get a standard that everybody can agree on?
And that interoperability applies just as much to software or pure software systems as it does to combinations of software and hardware, which is where MQTT sort of sits. So you can think about the process for standardization for Java itself, And for J2EE, companies build large applications, whole systems that are meant to last or will last decades, based on these standards for both the Java language and the J2EE building blocks that allow them to build enterprise applications. So it's equally applicable in pure software systems.
David, what is your view on what do you think? What are key metrics for a project to think about becoming a standard or not? Is there anything you see which is special?
I think that might be a good hint for the slide for the process. Let's assume, and I think this is substantiated with what Arlen and Ian said, that the aim of standardization in any technical area is to achieve transparent interoperability in the space. And there's not one standardization project in any area. This is actually a series of standardization projects. And you can start from code, but the universe will keep you honest. You know, like you want to achieve collaboration. You want to achieve interoperability among players. So your aim is having a transparent interoperability. So this is kind of a Petri nets diagram that shows you that is kind of a gateway-based diagram that will tell you what you need to do at any stage of your standardization process. If the transparent interoperability in your domain doesn't exist, you need to ask, is there an accepted reference architecture? If there is no accepted reference architecture, you need to ask, is there an accepted data model? If there is no accepted data model, then you are down. You know, you actually should think about starting the standardization project and develop that data model. After you have developed the data model, then like people have agreed on the data model, and you can progress to you can graduate to developing a reference architecture. After the reference architecture in your domain exists, you can it becomes more fun. You can start working on two different things, either develop different serializations, like some people worship JSON, some people worship XML, RDF, whatever. You need to develop these things for different serializations, computer programming languages, etc. And you can also start about advanced validation techniques. So this is about developing test suites, being able to make plugfests, really verify that your interoperability project leads somewhere. And after all these things are done, then you actually can say, we achieved transparent interoperability in our area. And so you notice pretty much every one of these green squares is a standardization project, and these standardization projects can have different needs, and you can go venue shopping for different sort of organizations, where to do that project. I think that's enough for the slide.
I think what we found out, Michael, we didn't have this fancy diagram, but I think we found out that that's the journey that we've taken both on MQTT as well as Sparkplug. So it is a very good notion. Now, you don't know what you don't know when you get into these things, but they will evolve into, I think, to David's point, to your point, is as you get these ecosystems put together of both manufacturers as well as end users of a product, regardless of if it's hardware, software, or a combination of both, you're going to ultimately come to that realization, or you're going to go broke, one of the two.
Okay. Yeah, great. And I think for everyone who is new to the topic, I think that may be a really interesting guideline to get started and run through the process, right?
Yep.
Great. So, given the time, it was a pleasure to talk to you. I think I learned a lot. I'm not the main subject matter expert on this one, so it was a pleasure to talk to you. It was a pleasure to get insights from your experience, and that is quite usual in the open source community. I'm sure if there are any questions, we are also, you are hopefully also happy to follow up any questions from the audience today. So if there's a need for the audience to get, let's say, some more deeper information, I'm happy to connect. And so let me say thank you to all of you. It was a pleasure to have you on the call. And yeah, so hopefully enjoy the rest of the EclipseCon.
Thanks.
Thanks, Michael.